Welcome to CISO Insider, Nightfall's chat with Chief Information Security Officers. We host CISOs from different industries to discuss their pathways to the role, the challenges they face in their everyday work, and lessons they can share with anyone aspiring to become a CISO. This podcast brings you into the world of cybersecurity and gives you a window into the most brilliant minds in the business. I'm Chris Martinez. Today on CISO Insider, Lisa Hawke from Everlaw joins us to talk about her journey from working in environmental law to security and compliance, the hidden skills necessary to succeed as an infosec leader, and a lot more. Please join us in welcoming Lisa to CISO Insider. Thanks so much, Lisa, for sitting down and talking with us. We really appreciate it. You've had a very distinguished career in environmental law and compliance. So I'd like to know what attracted you to the B2B SaaS space after going through that career path.
Great. Yeah. So I did study environmental science. That was my undergrad degree. And I worked as a bench chemist briefly after college before going to law school. So the reason I got into sort of the compliance space was through the legal angle. And when I got out of law school, I worked as a fellow for a bit at an environmental NGO before going into the regulatory world in the energy business. And so I started off, as you mentioned, in regulatory compliance at two different energy companies, mainly in the commodity trading space, so the energy commodities, which is quite technical from a compliance standpoint and very driven by various state and federal regulations. You know, I was in the energy business for almost a decade, and when I decided to leave, it was after a long stint of living in the Houston, Texas area, which I'm originally from the East Coast. And so although I loved living in Houston for quite a while, almost a decade, I eventually decided that I wanted to move closer to family. And so I actually jumped out of the energy business into B2B software, mainly because the company that I work for now was looking for somebody with experience building sort of policy compliance and those sort of risk management programs. Now I lead the security and compliance team.
So we saw that you've done a lot of writing for publications like TechCrunch and Above the Law. So I'd like to know, how did you get started with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I personally really enjoy writing. Some of the opportunities like TechCrunch and Above the Law have come through my company Everlaw's press team and their relationships with those sort of outlets, and you know what the outlet might be interested in publishing and what our press team might have up their sleeve. But some of the other writing I've done has been more self-driven, you know, through my own relationships. I've done some writing for Bloomberg Law as well as the Compliance and Ethics magazine run by the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and then my own blog. I think when it comes to writing and who you write for, a lot of it comes down to sort of what you're personally comfortable with. I like to focus on knowledge sharing or what I've learned or points of view on a specific thing that has happened in the news, like, for example, the FTC case with Facebook and the privacy and security programs that the FTC has been writing around in their orders, those sorts of things. So I try to do my best to stay away from anything that could be read as a sales pitch. But I think if folks are interested in writing for different outlets, what I would recommend is more, sticking to the what you've learned and points of view.
Cool, that makes sense. So as you mentioned, you're doing a lot of the writing, you're doing your career now in the B2B SaaS space. So how do you balance all of that along with your other commitments, like being a board member of some pretty prestige organizations in the Bay Area?
Well, how does anyone balance anything, I guess? That's a good question, though. I'm currently serving as vice chair and a board member of WISP, which is Women in Security and Privacy, which is a Bay Area-based nonprofit, although we have affiliated groups in several different locations, including DC, New York, and Dublin, Ireland. So between that and work and other things like writing, it's really hard. I mean, everyone probably talks about this, but you try not to work all the time, but especially in the COVID world where everyone's at home, it's easy to be working on something all the time, even if it's not your full-time job. So it can be tough to balance, but I try to stay focused on the things that keep me interested. And even though it is additional work, I try not to think of it that way. Although I got to say, I don't think I have any great advice for balancing a lot of commitments. There's no secret sauce there. It takes time.
You handled recovering and guiding operations for major disasters before, first in your work at BP, leading the compliance response to the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, and now you're doing the same with COVID-19. So can you share any lessons from the Deepwater Horizon incident that apply to today's uncertain landscape?
Sure. And, on Deepwater Horizon, I was part of the natural resource damage assessment team, but there were also 48,000 other people working on that response as well. So just want to note that. But I think, for me, if we're talking about lessons, what I learned during Deepwater and how I can apply that now, I think about complacency. And, one of the big lessons, at least for me, coming out of Deepwater, especially when you're dealing with uncertain environments, is, the importance of avoiding becoming complacent about anything. So in other words, you just have to constantly find ways to challenge your assumptions. And when it comes to security, I think of company culture and how your culture approaches security all the way to your operations and what you're actually doing from, a technical and operational standpoint. And the reason I think about this is because when I was at BP, when Deepwater happened, I was in the commodity trading shop. So I was in a part of the business that was completely unrelated to drilling. We were on the trading natural gas and power side of the world. And that part of the business had just gone through an entire regulatory compliance and compliance culture transformation because of a separate federal enforcement case that part of the business had just gone through. So when the Deepwater Horizon accident happened and the problems that caused that to take place, leading up to the accident, when that all came to light, it felt pretty unbelievable to folks in my part of the business because we'd been working so hard for multiple years on sort of changing the way the company approached compliance and thinking about safety. So it just showed me that, you can never get complacent about things. And so it's just important to not let that creep in. So now I think with a security hat and compliance hat, but, making sure that we're not assuming that everything is running smoothly and just finding ways to challenge it.
Can you name some hidden or lesser known skills needed to get to and succeed in this role?
To get to the role, I think is very different than succeeding in the role. And I have to say that when it comes to getting to the role, my personal experience is pretty unique in that I was actually hired in my company, Everlaw, as a director with a different title when the company was only 25 people. And my role has actually grown into what it is now. So when I see job descriptions for other CISO roles, quite frankly, I'm not sure how they find anyone who ever meets sort of all of those job qualifications and descriptions, especially if you look at my background. So the other question, though, to succeed in this role, from my perspective, there's a few critical skills that I can share. And one would be change management and sort of risk triaging in the context of your specific business and operations. And this is especially true at a startup. As a security leader, you won't be able to address every single thing, and you're going to have to choose what is most important in your business to address and what's most important to your customers and regulators.
All right. How is COVID-19 reshaping the CISO's duties and roles in everyday work and long-term security considerations?
Well, I think the thing that's on everybody's mind is, working remotely and supporting all of your team members that need to work remotely. If you were at a company that pre-COVID was more based in the office, of course, you had to make that transition pretty quickly. And I think just broadly, the transition to remote working and all of the impacts that COVID is having on businesses, both from a remote work, but also from a long-term planning perspective, it's an opportunity for security leaders, I think, to step up to the plate and help lead the organizations through, what is uncertain or tough time, especially at smaller companies where there might not already be a role dedicated to business continuity. So a lot of the if you think of the impacts coming out of the pandemic, they relate to security and privacy. Like, how can you operate your company securely with a remote workforce? How do you stand up those capabilities? How do you execute on return to work? If we can even think about that quite yet, as well as protecting all of your employees' privacy during this period where you may need to be collecting data from them that you never would have expected you had to before. And I think if you're a security leader that's already been thinking about things like contingency planning and disaster recovery in the context of security, you can sort of use those skills and help the business think through these other bigger COVID issues.
Good. Yeah, I think that's definitely the right way to look at it. What's the biggest change needed in the infosec community to attract and hire more women and people of color in the industry?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I personally don't think that attracting underrepresented folks is the problem. I think that there are tons of talented people who want to and are in the field already. The problem I see more relates to gatekeeping, whether that's in the form of unreasonable job descriptions, extremely expensive training and certifications, lack of actual entry-level roles, or biased hiring practices.
So, in your opinion, what could we as InfoSec professionals do to break down some of those barriers?
I think there's several things. Some of the more recent initiatives I've seen that are probably worth highlighting that I thought were great was the recent Share the Mic in Cyber campaign on Twitter. And that's something that some folks in the WISP community, the Women in Security and Privacy community, participated in. And WISP actually worked with the organizers of that campaign to set up a fundraiser to cover the training and certification expenses of all of the Black security and privacy practitioners who participated in that event. And so we have a fund, and I think last I checked, we'd raised around $16,000 to help support the advancement of those folks in the security and privacy field for the certification and training goals that they had. And I think efforts like that, where specific and discrete efforts to support folks get over these barriers and sort of gatekeeping activity. I have two trains of thought when it comes to certifications. In some cases, I think that they can be extremely valuable for folks to advance their careers, but it's very frustrating to see, how expensive they can be, especially for, some of the more well-known ones. I think that as an industry, if companies are going to require those types of certifications to interview candidates for roles, especially entry-level roles, then we have to do better as a community to make sure that folks are able to actually pursue those.
Also, talking about cybersecurity, where are some of the largest blind spots in the industry, and how can InfoSec leaders better approach these problems?
That's a great question. I think the specific blind spots probably depend on a company's industry or their specific threat model. When I think of potential blind spots on security, they're more likely to be sort of a discrete issue. But broadly, if I was going to mention anything, it would be company culture, just in general. I think culture can be a huge blind spot when building security programs. We, of course, hear a lot about security awareness, and there's some great programs and resources out there on security awareness, but awareness only works when you have a culture that supports things like incident reporting without fear of reprisal and asking for help. And so just practically speaking, the security team can't be involved in sort of every single workflow or process at your company that other teams are dealing with that have security implications, like handling customer data, for example. So you really need to have a culture where folks on the other teams are proactively coming to you on the security team. And that just all comes down to company culture.
Yeah, I think when we talk about cybersecurity and just succeeding in the industry, culture and the human side of it is often left out. So I'm really encouraged to hear that from you.
Yeah.
We also heard about that from one of our previous guests, Ty Sabano at CISO. He said basically the same thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with him.
Cool. What are the most difficult challenges InfoSec teams face with compliance like GDPR or CCPA?
Yeah, so on the privacy and data protection side, I think the biggest challenge there is just dealing with different data types and usage issues or usage use cases across the company. Privacy and data protection goes so far beyond just production data if you're a B2B SaaS company, because the definition of personal data, particularly under GDPR, is just so broad. And it's going to touch every team, not just your engineering team. and it requires a ton of change management to address sort of the actual requirements and best practices for privacy and data protection, but especially for the teams that are just not used to dealing with regulated data.
All right, so the next set of questions is the lightning round, and these are designed to be shorter responses, but of course you can say as much as you like. So first question in the lightning round, what is the biggest challenges that CISOs face today?
I think probably just keeping up. Back to your first question, there's no secret sauce to getting more hours in the day. So just being able to stay on top of the issue of the day that's cropping up, supporting your team and other teams, and then also just generally trying to chart a course for your company that keeps your business secure, but also enables growth.
And as a CISO, what makes you get out of bed or wakes you up in the morning every day?
I like to get up and go birding in the morning. So especially since the weather has turned nicer here where I'm based on the East Coast now, getting away from the screens, and being outside in the morning motivates me to, get back to my screen and get work done.
Nice. And can I ask where you like to go birding?
Well, right now I'm now based in New York City, so most mornings I'm over there in Central Park, which was really exciting in May during the spring migration. Things have slowed down a bit now that it's summertime, but there have been a lot of, hatchlings out. So it's been fun.
So we did cover the question of cybersecurity certifications, but I would like to go back to that just to talk about how much do they really matter when you're trying to climb the ladder, and how can infosec practitioners make the most out of them?
This is a really good question, and I hope it's something that the industry starts to, especially on the hiring side, starts to really dive into, because I think when it comes to certifications and whether they help you advance in your role once you're already in a role, I think it's very dependent on what your role is. So, for example, if you're in a role where incident response is your primary responsibility, then maybe a certification is not really going to help you advance there. Maybe it is more along the lines of getting the on the ground experience triaging in your company and getting a demonstrated track record of, being able to respond and escalate things as appropriate. So in my mind, it just comes down to the role. And I think what I see is that when you look at a lot of job descriptions, if they have any type of security in the title, whether it's security engineer or security GRC or security awareness and culture, things that are totally different from a day-to-day role perspective, a lot of times they just will list out the common security certifications, which I really don't think necessarily are that applicable for that role, if that makes sense. So I guess what I'm saying is I think certifications first can be important, but it really depends on the role. And then second, back to what I was saying before, I really hate to see when certifications are used as a gatekeeping mechanism for candidates, especially for entry-level roles. And I think that the industry really needs to take a look at, is a role an entry-level role, and what are our expectations of the person in this role over the first 3, 6, 9, 12 months? And why are we mentioning a certification? Is it really critical? And maybe it is for a specific role, but I just think that across the board, they're just overused in job descriptions.
What's the biggest lesson you've learned along the way that you wish you knew earlier in your career?
I think the one that comes to mind is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're all going to be working for a long time, hopefully, depending how old we are. So earlier in my career, I think I was more prone to just burning myself out. And, now I try to spend a lot of time thinking about priorities. And like I was saying earlier, I've learned to triage and focus on what's important. And that can be hard, especially if you're somebody who really loves being on the execution side, which I do. So it can be tough to sort of put the brakes on sometimes, but I think remembering that it's a marathon, not a sprint, is helpful.
And what are you most proud of as an infosec executive?
Well, I think, I was talking about company culture before, and I'm really proud of the culture of security that we have at Everlaw. We're so busy on my team because all of the other teams are constantly asking us for help or for feedback or for input on a process or a feature. And it's a lot of work, but it's something that we've worked really hard to cultivate and perpetuate. So I'm proud of the sort of state of the security culture as we have it now.
Thanks for listening to CISO Insider, a podcast created and sponsored by Nightfall AI, the industry's first cloud-native data loss prevention solution. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. The ratings and reviews help more people find us. Follow Nightfall on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Nightfall AI. That's Nightfall AI, and email us at marketing@nightfall.ai with questions, feedback, and suggestions about CISO Insider, including suggestions for CISOs you'd like to hear from. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next time.